Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is the podcast version from the video that's over on YouTube on the Plausible channel. You can find that if you put in at Sheridan's Online. That's SHERIDANS online. Then you can see the full version, the long version of the actual video relating to this podcast about Neil McCasland and who he is. But this is extended. We go into his thesis and some of the implications of that. So enjoy. Thank you. So who is Major William Neil McCasland? Well, I could state the standard stuff, his family history in the military, both his dad and his stepdad being lieutenants, and I think they were both lieutenants in the Air Force as well. And thus, his family history of military service already puts him in the creme de la creme for security clearance. So he works like that in a few militaries, especially the British. You can see a lot of the aristocracy hold military ranks, and the idea is there is the logic behind it, whether it's agreeable or not, is that these people are less likely to be traitors or defectors. They've got that family history there. It's a bit like someone owning a company and then passing it down generation to generation. They're more likely to take care of that company. If you get Joe Bloggs in, you don't know what they're you don't know what they could do. You don't know if they know the long-term picture, which puts you on I suppose, that inner circle, that security clearance above security clearance, if you get me. So no matter what you think of the security clearance, like in the UK we have developed vetting, which is like one of the highest ones you can go. There'll be some above that as well, I'm assuming, just purely through hierarchy. Just way it works. It's not so much a clearance, it's more the fact that whether you're in a trusted inner circle, as it were. But anyway, the I could talk about his various postings as well, which I'm sure we're all aware of, with Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, or about his badges, such as the Master of Space badge for Air Force Specialty Codes 13S and 1C6, which you can see just there. They require top secret security clearance, again with the security clearance, let alone his HQ Air Force badge or his office under the Secretary of Defense identification badge, which is that one just at the bottom. Even the fact that he was US Air Force is kind of misleading, as based on his postings, more joint operational is what he kind of tended to do, joint operational with the Space Force. Illustrated by a couple of stints as Vice Commander of the Space and Missile Systems Center. So I suppose when you get to the research side of things and to a certain rank, these labels are kind of semi-redundant, and like the joint operational part is more nuanced. It's kind of based on a postings basis. And he was actually into the research side of things. He was He was part of the Air Force Research Laboratory at Wright-Patterson. Also, he was Director of Special Programs, and thus was also Executive Secretary for the Special Access Program Oversight Committee. So he had oversight of America's most sensitive and secret technology, which, again, we're given his clearance in the background. And all of this information really makes his education history a little more interesting. As I noted, he has a degree in astronautical engineering and a master's from MIT in aeronautical engineering, whilst he got on a Hertz Foundation scholarship whilst also under the employment of the US Air Force. And later his PhD in astronautical engineering, where his supervisor was Richard Batin, which is someone, by the way, who was the primary designer for the Apollo program's guidance computer. He'd done his PhD in 1985, restarted it whilst he was still in full-time employment again by the US Air Force. So this was essentially a funded US Air Force PhD with the supervisor that was the head of a program in NASA. So it really does make you wonder what. I mentioned before that he was, I think I mentioned it, he was an engineer before he was actually doing his PhD. So he had quite a lot of security clearance before starting his PhD, working as an engineer. So then he obviously went on this this PhD scholarship essentially, because if he's employed by the military at the same time. So it just kind of makes me wonder what what the extra knowledge was worth for the Air Force to send him there. So I searched for his PhD thesis, and I roughly read it. I skim read bits, and I'll be honest, I used a bit of AI here to help summarize the document, as it was 194 pages long. And unfortunately, I don't have enough hours in the day to really unpack it fully. But I mean, I've read enough to get a rough grasp of it. Just not the total in depth, not fully behind all the mathematics behind it, but I will be reading it over the next few weeks, because actually it relates to something I'm working on as well. And if there's any addendums that needs to be made, I'll do a follow up of it, of what I got wrong. What if there is, I'm assuming this summary is correct, because it's based on the summary aspect of it and certain, like, the conclusion and stuff like that. So now this is where it gets interesting. Bearing in mind he was in the Air Force again when he done his PhD, and he served as the Payload Systems Division with the Secretary of the Air Force of Special Projects 6 and 8 at Los Angeles Air Force Base. So a few things. LA Air Force Base supports the HQ for Space Systems Division, SSD. So essentially, it's the Space Force before it was the Space Force itself was founded. Now, that's another thing which I'm going to touch on in a video in the future, which I'm slowly progressing and finding research on. It's so strange, these space forces that's popped up from America to Canada to Britain, numerous countries, Australia. I think even South American countries like Brazil, I think, got a space force. But it's all within a window between 2019, 2022, about that. There was a certain period of a few years where all these countries started creating a space force. And I find that very interesting, that they've all kind of followed suit, or specific countries. So, but that's a video for another day. So the Special Project 8, again, this is a Space Command project. And back in the day, this was specific to space technology and research development. So he was assigned, this is what I was touching on earlier, he was assigned to this before he'd done his master's and before he'd done his PhD, which is an important point, given his rank at the time went from second lieutenant in 1979 to first lieutenant in 1981, and then captain in 1983. He'd done his doctorate after this until 1988, on which, after graduation, he became assistant director for the Systems Engineering Secretary of the Air Force Office of Special Projects 13. Now, he worked previously on Special Projects 6 and 8. You can find information out about Special Projects 6 and 8, albeit very, very brief, very narrow scope of it. But I have tried looking for Special Projects 13, and it's quite hard to find, because whenever you look up this, it kind of redirects you for the Secretary of the Air Force for Special Investigations 13, which is a totally different department. And I find it quite interesting when you can find information about some things, Project 6 and 8, like some sections of an overall area, and yet one area you can't find information on. Then it makes me more intrigued as to what is that area. Why is that so hard to find information on compared to the other areas? So yeah, 6 and 8 weren't too hard to find about. 13, what is it? Like, what's there? It leads me to another element of Major General McCasland then. So he worked at Project 6 and 8, and then he does his PhD, and he comes back and he works for Project 13. So it got me thinking, what was his PhD on then? When he was already in the Air Force, and his PhD was underpaid employment by the Air Force, whilst under a supervision from a key person in the NASA Apollo program. And it gets geeky here, but it's quite good. So his thesis was Sensor and Actuator Selection for Fault-Tolerant Control of Flexible Structures. So what is this? Bear with me for a bit of geekiness. It's essentially a systematic optimization method to choose sensor or actuator location that maximize controllability over a system. So it involves influencing the system in question. So maximizing observability of the system is the ability to kind of measure the system in question, and remain effective, and also to remain effective under failure scenarios, which we will go into later as well. So mathematically, it uses Gramians as a performance measure. So in this section, I go into more detail in the podcast, but for the video, I'll just proceed as normal. So Gramians, like the controllability and observability Gramians in this paper, are in general, they measure how much energy is needed to control the system and how well states show up in outputs. Now, Dr. McCasland, as he was a PhD in astronautical engineering, uses Gramians with state scaling or normalization, and the Gramian depends on your coordinate system. So choosing a physically meaningful scaling with a finite t, so time is definite, it's not infinite time, which makes sense for lightly damped spacecraft, for example. With physically meaningful control weighting matrix and measurement weighting matrix as well. So in general, this thesis develops a way to optimally couple information and control into high-dimensional physical systems, while ensuring that the coupling remains effective even when parts of the interface fail. So there's that failure point. Some core points about this are, this helps to determine a system model of what you want to control. For example, an aircraft or a beam or something. Something with spatial placement of sensors and actuators kind of incorporated into this. So if you can think of something like again, the craft is a good thing whereby it's going to have a spatial placement of sensors and actuators. So it helps. That's why I say it helps define and optimize the controllability and observability of these on the craft. So from the thesis, he utilizes eigenvalues as how accessible each direction is, and the eigenvectors are the directions themselves. And the resultant Jacobian is the norm of WC, because it's so the controllability, and WO is the observability. So the trace of WC maps to the total controllability, whereas the determinant of WO maps to the volume of reachable space, and minimum eigenvalue maps to the worst case direction. But Dr. McCasland uses a linear in contributions from each actuator or sensor. This means that the WC, the controllability, is a lot less messy as it's no longer linear. So in his thesis, from this, he uses a fractional actuator or sensor placements instead of binary of 1 or 0. So the actuator or sensor strength is a continuous value. This basically results in a convex optimization problem, which is a lot easier to solve, and gives a global optimum, which is then continuous. Then just round to a discrete placement from that. For failures, 1 is working and 0 is failed, this becomes continuous. So you're again optimizing expected controllability or observability under failure. So you can essentially design a set of systems under failures that are acceptable. From an information-based view, you could see this as the following. For controllability, it's how information spreads into state. For observability, it's how state information reaches observation. In general, his thesis relates directly to a theory I'm working on about information flow and causal accessibility. In fact, his thesis actually backs up and actually helps bridge some of my theory on the part that I was stuck on, which is great news for my theory, but that's for another podcast. An underlying deeper idea behind his thesis implicitly shows geometry of interaction matters more than quantity of components, which again aligns with my theory. So in summary, his thesis develops a way to optimally couple information and control into a high-dimensional physical system while ensuring that this coupling remains effective even when parts of the interface fail. So what are the practical implications of his thesis? This is a key point in the episode, really. Okay, so the implications of his thesis. It does have good applications in aerospace structures like wings, etc., in civil engineering also. Robotics like precision manufacturing systems, spacecraft and satellites, absolutely it does. Helps with sensor placement, fewer sensors but in smarter locations, and will still work if some components fail. So failure optimization. Energy efficiency, this is a good one. You need less control effort or energy, which again is important for spacecraft or autonomous systems. The thesis also kind of implies that things are scalable to larger systems easier. Now, deeper implications, like controllability is fundamentally about how we inject or extract information from a system. Actuators, you can say, inject the information, sensors extract the information, and placement could determine information accessibility. Not all degrees of freedom are equal. Again, this kind of ties in with my theory I'm working on, but again, that's for another video. In a system with many modes, some can be easy to control, some are almost inaccessible. The geometry as well. This is another good one. Where you interact with the system matters more than how much you interact with it. So optimal placements beats a brute force, and a structure of interaction can define the capability. So it's not all about the amount of energy behind it. By optimizing that energy, the placement of that, that's the optimal. Robustness as a property of structure. So designing robustness into control laws. The thesis implies robustness can be built into the geometry of a system interface. Also, failure is a feature, whereas most systems treat failure as an exception. Using the thesis, failure can be built into the system for optimization. So we can extend some of these into hypothetical implications. So for a physics interpretation, system modes equal physical degrees of freedom. Sensors or actuators equal the coupling to those modes, essentially optimizing coupling to a field. Again, this kind of relates to my theory, but it's theory about space-time and how systems are causally reachable or even detectable. Essentially, this thesis comes down to better placement equals fewer components, more reliability and lower cost. So the crux of this is, how does this relate to UFOs? So this is slightly speculative, but nothing absurdly unmathematical. So a craft could achieve unusual motion by extremely advanced sensor or actuator placement for full exploitation of structure modes. So essentially using the entire craft as a control system, this could look like controlling forces, the control of the forces that are distributed across the structure of the craft. So you could look like no obvious engines or method of propulsion, and results in motion that looks smooth and instantaneous and non-inertial. This doesn't break the laws of physics, just maximizing the controllability of the system. So, I mean, we can extend this further. Instead of controlling the craft, it could theoretically be a case of the craft controlling the field around it. So the craft itself could control the space-time electromagnetic field, plasma, etc. around the craft. Then the actuators are coupling points into the field, and the sensors are the measurement of the field's response. So essentially, the placing of these are to maximize the influence over a field. So this would imply optimized coupling into the surrounding fields. This could theoretically manipulate local dynamics efficiently. And then you're talking, it reduce the required energy and again, achieve unusual motion profiles. This is mathematically possible, but just with kind of unknown physics. Probably not with the more unknown engineering response to our understanding of physics. So then you have to ask, if these are mathematically possible but not within our current understanding of physics, does this sound familiar? Like some sort of perhaps reverse engineering. We hear about the UFOs and reverse engineering projects. And if they are reverse engineering something, it would look something like this, whereby we wouldn't fully understand the physics behind it, but we would know little points which kind of piece it together, little parts of the glue that kind of think, okay, well, it's doing this, so we can explain it this way. But we don't understand the full reasoning and logic behind the physics that makes it work as such. But the main thing that kind of relates to my theory with Dr. McCasland's thesis is like are actually just that a system may have degrees of freedom that we're unaware of, and the craft interaction is just selecting a subspace of observable reality. So, just because it seems to be moving instantaneous, is it just moving in a subspace of our reality that we don't understand fully? So when you think overall about his research, I know it's a very brief summary for a large paper, but when you think about the way it's laid out, and it seems to be, it can be applied quite well in terms of applied to spacecraft, and I can kind of see a comparison there with something like almost like a reverse engineering type element to it. And I think, given that he was under employment by the RAF as a researcher for many years, and he's worked alongside NASA astronauts, there's a lot of background. Dr. Neil McCasland, or William Neil McCasland, and I think that stuff can't be ignored. And so with his recent disappearance, it is strange. Major generals just do not go missing unless someone wants them to go missing. And perhaps this is something as simple as like some sort of domestic sort of argument. I don't want to pry on his domestic situation. It could be something like that. But again, I don't see it. There's been no end of teams out searching, going door to door, helicopters, all sorts. I'm sure we're all aware of the search effort that's involved. Again, major generals do not just go missing. Not in the most powerful country in the world with the best military and some of the best homeland security and monitoring systems. They do not go missing. So it makes you question. It makes you question things. And given his background, is it tied in with this? And I suppose this is where the plausibility meter really comes into play. Is this something more than just a person who's gone missing, or is there something a bit fishy about his disappearance? And I think I'm going to have to put this as, let's move that. I'm going to have to put this as at least a 10 on the plausometer, because given his background and everything, I think this is a very fishy. Just around the same time Trump announced the release of the alien and UFO files, and then one of the key players in it disappears with all this background, and we've all heard about the emails, apparently for talks of disclosure. We just have to wait to see, but I think I'm going to put this on at 10 at least. I mean, in all honesty, it's like they think we're bloody stupid. It's like that person who died on a boat 2 days after, or the day after, his colleague got run over on a road somewhere when it was just after a lawsuit or something. I don't know what the libel laws are, but yeah, we all know.